Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is trying to secure a fair deal for Alberta with a new panel to find ways to make the province more independent. Joining us this morning is John Sorosky. He's a political science professor at McEwen University in Edmonton. He's joining us from Calgary this morning. Good to speak with you again.
Hi, Anne-Marie.
Hi. So over the weekend, Jason Kenney giving a speech in which he announced this fair deal panel. He has said he doesn't see Alberta leaving, but he says the status quo is not acceptable to him or the people in his province. The panel will focus on ideas such as establishing a provincial revenue agency, withdrawing from the Canada Pension Plan, and drafting a provincial constitution. So how would a more independent Alberta affect the rest of Canada?
Well, there's a huge range of sort of potential proposals there. I think there's 6 or 8, some in addition to the ones you noted. So some of them would be more symbolic without too much effect on Canada. So a provincial constitution, for example, but probably some of the key changes that would be, a fairly large-scale impact on the rest of Canada. In particular, if Alberta withdrew from the Canada Pension Plan, there was a study done a couple of years ago by the Fraser Institute that suggested that Alberta contributions to its own new unique pension fund would be about half the level they are now for current Alberta workers, and you could see increases for workers' contributions to CPP in the remainder of Canada going up by on the order of about $350 a year for contributors. Now, that's, as I say, that's one estimate, but it indicates if Alberta did go on its own because it's got a younger population, it would save a lot of money in those contributions. So that would be a fairly large change. Other changes like provincial tax collection, creating our own provincial police force, those would have relatively lesser impact than those large-scale ones.
Premier Kenney saying none of these ideas would be put into action without Albertans voting for them in a referendum. It sounds a lot like what we saw over in the UK with Brexit, a group coming up with ideas, putting it forward to the people in the country. How much support do you think Kenney would receive from Albertans for some of these proposals?
Well, I think at the current moment, as the election results indicated, there's a high level of discontent in Alberta. I don't think it rises to the level that, something like Wexit, as it's called, is a likelihood. But I do think that there's a lot of support in Alberta for the Premier taking a tougher stance against Ottawa. And it's interesting, some of these, sorts of changes I think are largely symbolic. They wouldn't change life in Alberta that much, things like provincial tax collection, the RCMP, as I said, provincial constitution. But they're all kind of statements of, distancing Alberta from the larger Canadian community. And I think at the moment, certainly tensions are high enough here that I think there'd be a lot of support for Premier Kenney on at least many of these.
Alberta opposition leader Rachel Notley, the former premier of Alberta, has responded to this. She says, quote, "Alberta is part of Canada and Jason Kenney needs to accept that." But despite her sentiment, you suspect he is going to have considerable support. What kind of approval would they need from Ottawa, if any, to institute some of these measures?
Well, that's a great question. As I say, there's half a dozen ideas here. So if you think of the major ones, so for the Canada Pension Plan, the province is constitutionally entitled to establish its own pension. So there'd be a period of complex negotiation, but that is entirely, ultimately, an Alberta decision, although over the long run. The Premier has also talked about a referendum on equalization. Equalization is a federal program, so there's very little likelihood that Alberta, whatever, a vote on an imaginary referendum on the issue would be, will have any direct impact. The Premier has said, though, for example, he would like to negotiate with Ottawa, some changes in some of the side elements, including, elements that provide compensation to provinces that have had economic downturns. It's quite possible that the Trudeau government might give way on some of that. It implies, a few $1 billion, probably every decade or so. So those are things that are possible. Provincial tax collection is also entirely within the hands of the province. It can move that way. It doesn't have much impact, but those are things the province can do on its own. At the far out end of the spectrum, the Premier and others have sort of mused about the idea of Alberta no longer participating in national shared cost programs like the Medicare or the healthcare program in Canada. Again, Alberta could unilaterally withdraw from that, but then it would lose the funds. So that's unlikely, but that could be done without support, but again, without too much benefit to the province.
John, it's always good to talk to you. It's interesting to note when you look a little deeper as well, who is on that panel, including Stephen Lougheed, the son of former Premier Peter Lougheed. We're going to have to wrap up there, but we will be talking to you in the days to come. Thanks for joining us from Calgary today.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you like this, be sure to subscribe here.
And you can check out more Your Morning videos right here.